when democracy equals empire. Get a dictionary, open it to democracy. It says noun, Greek, demokratia, demos, people, and kratos, strength or power. That form of government in which the supreme power rests with the people. Every American president, whether Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, speaks lovingly of democracy whenever the nation engages in some escapade abroad. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, it did so ostensibly to bring democracy to the Middle East. When it launches a raid in Grenada or rains death on a poor neighborhood in Panama, when it invaded Haiti in the last century ad infinitum, it always did so in the name of restoring democracy. What is this democracy of which they so blithely speak? We all have heard the term since our infancy, but who really knows what it means? I wanted to learn more about it, so I began to read one of the finest historians I know of, the great C.L.R. James, author of the groundbreaking The Black Jacobins, an influential study of the Haitian Revolution. Some years ago, James published a pamphlet titled Every Cook Can Govern, a study of democracy in ancient Greece. I found myself, as I often am when I read his stuff, blown away by what I learned. As his subtitle suggests, James looks at Greek history for the roots of the democratic idea and finds it, in some stages, truly democratic in ways we can hardly imagine. He writes, perhaps the most striking thing about Greek democracy was that the administration, and there were immense administrative problems, was organized upon the basis of what is known as sortition, or, more easily, selection by lot. The vast majority of Greek officials were chosen by a method which amounted to putting names into a hat and appointing the ones whose names came out. Now, the average C-10 bureaucrat or labor member of parliament in Britain would fall in a fit if it were suggested to him that any worker selected at random could do the work he is doing. But that was precisely the guiding principle of Greek democracy. And this form of government is the government under which flourished the greatest civilization the world has ever known, he wrote. C.L.R. James, a revolutionary activist as well as a stellar historian, explains that in Greek, the term demokratia could be used interchangeably with the word isonomia, which meant equality. Using this system, the Greek city-state decided issues of war and peace, of taxation, of cultural affairs, and virtually every important affair of state. They were so conscious of the seduction of power, and they so opposed tyranny, that a man who, and yes, they tended to only allow the franchise to men, held public office could not serve again as a general rule. Their service was also subject to a time limit. Some historians have quite rightly noted that the Greek democracy rested upon slavery. That is true. But James tells us it was a slavery that enrages notorious snobs like Plato, who had trouble identifying who was slave and who was free. And he resented the fact that slaves would not clear the street when he walked upon it. The Greeks, James notes, tried representative democracy and rejected it out of hand. What worked for them was direct democracy, which means that they believed that all were capable of governing the society in which they lived. The very fact that such an idea surprises us tells us how far this era has drifted from the fundamental notions of democracy. In ancient Greece, the citizen was seen as an able, trusted element of the state. In the present era, the citizen is virtually superfluous. He is a tax source. She is one who obeys her leaders. He is a dispensable cog in the wheel, whose only real duty is to do what one is told. Consider the mass demonstrations of spring 2003, when millions took to the streets of Washington, London, and San Francisco, demanding that there be no war in Iraq. Here, in the alleged democracies of England and the U.S., governments ignored the people and engaged in imperial war on a lie. In ancient Greece, some 2,500 years ago, this wouldn't have been allowed. We don't live in a democracy. We live under the rule of a few. We live in an empire.
The whole idea behind democracy is that the general public should participate in making the decisions that affect their lives. Democracy, like freedom, can take many forms. Even in totalitarian states, there are some freedoms. Likewise with the democracy. There are some states such as Cuba and Iran that practice small amounts of democracy, and yet they are limited to a narrow range of options, and most would say they are not democratic at all. There are generally two different types of democracy, representative and direct. However, representative democracy is not democratic. Direct or participatory democracy allows the voice of the public to be heard, unhindered in its purest form. This allows the members to be self-managed without the use of bureaucrats and politicians. I think we can all agree that politicians are corrupt. Every day, someone is being accused of and exposed for their crimes, ranging from perjury to theft of public money. Society should not be forced to choose the best of two evils. The Center for Responsive Politics, the leading nonpartisan organization that records money in politics, found that in the 2008 elections, 93% of the House of Representative races and 94% of the Senate were won by the candidate who spent the most money. This reality is not just reserved for Congress. Barack Obama also outspent all other candidates, including John McCain, to win the presidency. Much of the money that comes from political financing is produced by corporate donations, political action committees, and wealthy individuals. Top industries literally spent billions of dollars to pay for our current Congress. In 2008, there were 14,800 lobbyists who spent $3.3 billion to influence politicians. This is pretty amazing considering there are only 535 members of Congress. This shows that one person, one vote is just a myth. It is money, not people, that decide the fate of elections and our lives. Politicians do not represent the public. Instead, they represent industries who pay for them to be there. In order to win elections, the politicians must hire teams of people who turn them into demagogues, who use certain phrases, dress in certain clothes, use ambiguous forms of speech about ideas that nearly 100% of the public agrees with, such as the right to freedom and democracy. Their speeches are rehearsed, studied, calculated, marketed, spun, and branded. In the meantime, politicians must hide their true motives, personality, vices, and beliefs. Because speeches are so vague, this causes people to interpret them to the point of conspiracy theories. Politicians may be moral as individual people, but by necessity, they must participate in a system which forces them to be dishonest. They cannot act and say what they want to say. Political representatives do not represent society because their actions are geared to appeal to the least common denominator. When they do act, we can see who they truly represent. According to a study from the University of Kansas, big companies that spent hundreds of millions lobbying successfully for tax breaks enacted in 2004 got a 22,000% return on that investment. Even worse are the companies who received money from the TARP bailouts. Those companies received 258,000% for the $114 million they spent on campaign donations and lobbying. There is also a history of the government working closely with the business sector, allowing executives to move from the private to the public sector and vice versa. The executives don't stop working for the benefit of the private sector while they are in public office. Companies pay to have access for their own people to sit at the table, creating favors they will receive, usually in the form of regulation and deregulation, tax breaks, and other gifts. Elections are big business. Money always wins. The system of democracy should move from the bottom up. Instead, authority flows downward to shape people's thoughts, hopes, attitudes, and beliefs. Politicians tell people what they should think, dream, and who they should hate, fear, and worship. They shape who we are instead of the other way around. To win elections, our representatives acquiesce to money powers and comply to the public relation firms, the front groups, and the powerful think tanks to help manipulate the media. All of these groups collude in vast networks, propagating information and molding public opinion into what moneyed interests deem to be important, making sure that certain issues are not raised by minimizing debate, and attacking any group that threatens their own welfare. The greatest danger this system produces is the narrowing range of political debate. We are told again and again that the political spectrum is no broader than the range of Republican and Democrat, that society can only make decisions that fall into the realm of taxes, abortion, healthcare, and education. But even these issues fall into a limited range. The political realm has been virtually nullified. There is no meaningful change because the system of representative democracy, by its very nature, demands consistently flat results. It shouldn't be that every 2 to 4 years we leave our homes to vote for one of 2 people to become our representative. This one person is supposed to represent the public will and make decisions for every human being that they represent. It doesn't matter that 63% of Utah didn't vote for Obama, or that 58% of New York voted against Bush. They will have to listen and submit themselves to the rule of this human being that they have never met and will never meet. These outcomes are against the very idea of freedom. As President Bush always liked to say, "I am the decider." While some people found this statement undemocratic, it is the reality of our nation. All of this is not to say that democracy is inherently evil, but politicians are not representatives or even expressions of human wants, desires, or wishes. It's not that politicians want to be bureaucratic. They are bureaucrats. And it's not like some politicians are demagogues and others not. They all are. They have to be demagogues to win elections. Politicians may not like lying, pretending, spouting catchphrases, or even kissing babies. They have to take money for favors to help large corporations and industries if they want to win. It's easy to see that our politicians are anything but representative of the makeup of our society. Aside from the obvious race and gender gap, these people do not live in the same economic bracket as the rest of society. The personal finances in the House of Representatives averages out to about $5 million, while the typical senator household brings in closer to 16. Jane Harman of California leads the list with a net worth of almost $400 million. These Congress members are not a composite of American society. They do not live in the same houses as we do. They do not understand what it is like not to have health insurance. They do not understand the daily suffering of ordinary Americans. They don't work regular jobs. Some have never even been a part of the workforce. These so-called representatives fly in private jets, attend parties that we will never attend, eat at restaurants we could never afford, dress in clothes we will never wear, and relax on yachts we will only see in the movies. These people know nothing of our lives and our financial struggles. It has long been known that the Soviet style of economics does not work because a small group of elites cannot know all the intricacies and interactions of an entire functioning economy and society. It's just too complex. Only the people on the ground can have any true understanding of the needs and wants to fulfill their lives and thereby create a society that will fulfill the public's wishes. Our style of democracy shares the same dysfunctional nature as the Soviets. Until we can form new ways of social interaction and decision-making, we cannot say we live in a truly democratic society, because representative democracy is not democracy and never has been. Our system of voting takes ordinary people and turns them into immoral politicians. The politicians become corrupt, not because they want to, but because the system requires it. These people cannot be reformed, because the apparatus in which they work does not allow it. Trying to find the best politician is not the answer. The reason why is because politicians should not exist, nor should the system of representative democracy. Participatory democracy is a system in which people vote in collective gatherings in order to decide their fate and maximize collective liberty. Again, this type of democracy should have absolutely no bearing on the individual. People are to act, say, and do as they please, as long as they do not harm others or their possessions. Participatory democracy should only exist in the realm where people congregate and everyone in that group is affected. Its function is not for personal liberty, but collective liberty. One without the other is like saying you are half free. Instead of one person telling everyone else what to do, the group as a whole makes the decisions. This group is said to be self-managed. One person, one vote. There are no leaders or hierarchies. Everyone is equal. If a member chooses not to vote, that's fine. He or she should not be forced to do so. In order for this type of democracy to work, groups or assemblies should not exceed 250 people. Otherwise, not everyone would be heard and the system would become too complex. Representatives, such as politicians or managers, are replaced by delegates. Delegates are elected by the group. They make no speeches and hold no formal power. Their only job is to carry out the tasks assigned by the group. If the group makes a decision and the delegate carries out a different task, they can be recalled. In a society organized like this, a decentralized network of communities would naturally occur, with groups that would freely associate with one another. Democracy should be directly proportional to how it affects your life. In other words, more power is held in the community rather than some far-off place. Decisions would not flow down, but would bubble up from the surface naturally and express society's greatest wishes. This would allow the people to create a society based on their own desires and dreams, rather than the isolated society they exist in today. It is a sick society when we barely know our neighbors, when we walk past each other with a hesitated glance, when our fellow workers are seen as nothing more than competition, and when an elite minority dominates the majority. A participatory democracy allows us to interact within our communities, our workplace, and our social gatherings in an atmosphere of equality, mutual respect, and mutual agreement. We should be the ones making the decisions, coming up with the ideas, and implementing the ends with our fellow human beings. Today, we are working collectively not for kings or monarchs, but for our paymasters. We work for politicians who use our money for their hidden agendas. We work for CEOs who steal a portion of our labor for their personal gain. These are the new kings. They hold society in shackles while they are free. It is not just collective liberty that is being held hostage to their whims. It is the individual. Currently, all of our energy, creativity, intelligence, time, and liberty are working for an elite minority. They are nothing but thieves living off of our blood, sweat, and tears for their freedom. In a participatory democracy, groups can come together freely and decide their own future. Our ancestors built the pyramid for the pharaohs. Imagine what a free society could achieve if it were free to manage its resources and labor. Humans, while superficially different, are almost identical in DNA to each other. Our DNA is physically expressed in the flesh, including the makeup of our brain. As a result, our thoughts, ideas, emotions, morality, and hopes travel the same path. Again, the differences in physicality are superficial. A common thread is the desire to pursue personal satisfaction in a wide range of human experience. My personal hope is that true freedom, extended by participatory democracy to all, would push society towards something along the lines of post-scarcity. Resources would be available to everyone, eliminating need, poverty, and economic suffering. Tedious jobs would be automated to reduce unnecessary tasks, so that work becomes a choice. In this environment, we would be free to spend our time pursuing the things we love, such as art, sports, socializing with friends and family, playing music, traveling, learning, or just daydreaming. The human desire to create would produce genuine, rather than competitive innovation. Whether this future is achievable is yet to be seen. However, these ideas can only be achieved if people work toward these ends. Throughout history, rulers, be they kings, chiefs, monarchs, dictators, managers, or politicians, have dominated our lives. As time has passed, the one has turned into the many. They have been the decision makers, telling us how to live, what to think, and how to be. Their time is over. A participatory democracy makes everyone a ruler unto themselves. In this decentralized system, individuals represent only themselves in free association and self-manage their own affairs in an equitable and just manner. Today, hierarchy creates a division where only a few decide our fate and our lives. This totally inefficient system neglects the natural human capacity, intelligence, and creativity of individuals. A group of 20 people conversing, debating, assessing, and considering all possibilities is better than a few that manage our affairs. Today, ideas are not considered or even heard in order to retain the division of power and wealth. This paternalistic system turns people into idiotic creatures and into people who walk through life like zombies, quiet, helpless, and alone. When others make decisions for us and tell us how to live and act, we naturally gravitate toward a state of infancy. People in society need to have a say, a choice, a sense of power, and their own voice. Our centralized and bureaucratic system of authority is crushing our spirit. Society and its institutions are not designed for human beings. Our system of representative democracy is an anti-human system and should have been left in the dustbin of the 20th century. Our best option for freedom, true freedom, both collective and individual, is through a system of participatory democracy. It is time to strip our masters of their power to dominate and humiliate us. Individual freedom has made tremendous strides in the last 100 years, but without collective freedom, whether it exists in the workplace or in the political realm, is only half freedom. Until then, we cannot say that
if a community's economic distribution becomes slanted, then despotism stands a better chance to gain a foothold. A power scale is another important yardstick of despotism. It gauges the citizens' share in making the community's decisions. Communities which concentrate decision-making in a few hands rate low on a power scale and are moving towards despotism. And to find out what way it is likely to go in the future, you can rate it on economic distribution and information scales. The lower your community rates on economic distribution and information scales, the lower it is likely to rate on respect and power scales, and thus to approach despotism.
John Milton once said that those who put out the people's eyes reproach them of their blindness. Indeed, minority rule corrupts the judgment of the majority. That's why only participation and self-management allow majorities to fully realize minority rights and private areas of decision-making. This means that current restrictions on participation in the name of minority rights actually enforce the herd mentality, undermining minority and individual freedom rather than protecting them. Undoubtedly, the greatest massacres and injustices in history have been perpetrated under the leadership or influence of elite minorities, not by the democratic impulse of the masses. Is it really surprising that the elite minority would try to convince the very majority over which they rule about the so-called tyranny of the majority? But no, that's not what democracy is about.
How much say we have over our lives, how much influence we have over decisions. One person might say we should have majority rule. Everybody gets the same vote, we tally them up, 50% plus one wins. Another person might say we should have consensus. Our value for decision making is consensus. We should all at least abide or sign off on any decision. Another person might say, well, I think that maybe the one person should decide. Somebody might say that. I actually say all three, and many other things. I don't think any of those are a principle. They're all algorithms. They're all methods of arriving at a decision. But they're not a principle. One of them is right in one context, and one of them is right in another context. When you got dressed this morning, you didn't say to yourself, we should have a majority vote of everybody who's going to be there on what color socks I wear. And that made sense, because that decision, it was appropriate to make that way. On the other hand, if you wanted to carry around a boombox and play it in here during the talk, you don't get to decide that all by yourself. Why not? Because we all hear it. And the idea here is that people should have a say in decisions in proportion to the degree we're affected by them. Now, we're not going to be anal about this. It isn't to the 6th decimal point, but broadly speaking, people should impact decisions in proportion to the degree where they're affected by them. The name for this, I think, reasonably, is self-management.
If you want to control the state, you better have some fairly serious party and press mechanisms that work pretty well. In effect, you need to be financing the election campaigns.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. Unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive. We now face the most awesome problems of human history. Problems such as the likelihood of nuclear conflict, the destruction of a fragile environment.
couple hundred years ago. The deal is that back then, people had some visions of a more direct democracy.
Why do you think more participation by the public, more democracy is the answer? Because, well, more democracy is a value in itself. So, quite apart, because democracy is a value, it doesn't have to be defended any more than freedom has to be defended. It's an essential feature of human nature that people should be free, they should be able to participate, they should be uncoerced, and so on. These are values in themselves. Why do you think, if we go that route, I think that it's the only hope that I can see that other values will come to the fore. I mean, if the society is based on control by private wealth, it will reflect the values that it in fact does reflect, the value that the only real human property is the desire is greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of others. Now, any society, maybe a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, and that's what we are.
And so we now have a setup where, starting from the get-go, the people were left out of the picture and the elites control the government. And so that has carried us forward to where we are today. In the past, we could get away with it because the damage we were doing was fairly limited. But now, with the environment, with the technology we have, the ability to destroy the planet with our nuclear capability, the destroying of the planet with our industrialization on a guaranteed way, and with the globalization of our economic systems, which are in no man's land, we're in very serious trouble. And so there's really only two alternatives where you can deal with this. The people that are causing the problem, which means the government, the control of the government in the hands of elites, or you can deal with it with the people. Now you've all been weaned on the concept that you control the government by your vote on election day. Well, for about 2 seconds, when you throw that lever, you got power. And the minute you throw that lever, you're giving your power away.
In a democracy, people should be able to enjoy freedom from economic as well as political oppression. In a real democracy, the material conditions of people's lives should be humane and not insufferable. Anatole France once wrote, "The law, in its majestic equality, prohibits rich and poor alike from stealing bread and begging in the streets." And so the law becomes something of a farce, a fiction that allows us to speak of the rights of all, divorced from the class conditions that often place the rich above the law and the poor way below it. In the absence of certain material conditions, formal rights are of little value to millions who lack the means to make a reality of their rights. Take the idea that every citizen has a right to be heard. In its majestic equality, the law allows both the rich and the poor to raise high their political voices. Both are free to hire the best-placed lobbyists and Washington lawyers to pressure public office holders. Both are free to shape public opinion by owning a newspaper or television station. And both rich and poor have the right to engage in multi-million-dollar election campaigns to win office for themselves or their political favorite. But again, this formal equality is something of a fiction. Of what good are the rules for those millions who are excluded from the game? We're taught that capitalism and democracy go together. In fact, many capitalist societies, from Nazi Germany to today's third world dictatorships, have private enterprise systems but no political freedom, and plenty of mass poverty. We're taught that capitalism and prosperity go together, and yet impoverished countries like capitalist Haiti, capitalist Nigeria, capitalist Indonesia, the mass of people live in terrible poverty. In such systems, economic freedom means the freedom to exploit the labor of the poor and get endlessly rich, and means little more than that. So transnational corporate capitalism is no guarantee of political democracy. When it works with any effectiveness, democracy is dedicated to protecting the well-being of the many and rolling back the economic oppressions and privileges that serve the few. Democracy attributes equal value to all individuals and seeks to ensure that even those who aren't advantaged by wealth or special talent can earn a decent living. The contradictory nature of capitalist democracy is that it professes egalitarian political principles while generating enormous disparities in material well-being and political influence. Some people think that if you're free to say what you like, you're living in a democracy. But freedom of speech is not the sum total of democracy, only one of its necessary conditions. Too often we're free to say what we want, while those of wealth and power are free to do what they want to us, regardless of what we say. Democracy is not a seminar, but a system of power, like any other form of governance. Freedom of speech, like freedom of assembly and freedom of political organization, is meaningful only if the free speech is heard and if it keeps those in power responsive to those over whom power is exercised.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. Dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people.
It's always been that the decisions made by the few, with the money and the power, dictated the priorities of their government and the stories in the media. They determine the lives and the opportunities of their citizens.
And friends, I say this, not just because it is the right thing to do, but because history shows us
democracy is coming to the youth.
Freedom, democracy, and justice. By working together as a light in a world emerging from a deep darkness.
In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world.
You must speak. I can't. You must. It's our only hope.
Several processes must be developed in parallel to allow the emergence of a true democracy. First, there must be enough indignant, outraged people who see the injustices of the system. We need a general awareness about the nature of our societies. We live in an oligarchy, not in a democracy. The links between our political systems and economic and social problems must be explained. The injustices on the many brought upon by the minority ruling class. This first part is sort of an enhanced awareness, which would give rise to the second stage, possibly enabling citizens to resolve the problem. The revolution therefore requires a general mobilization of all indignant, not only against the current system, but mostly for a concrete alternative. Thus the 15M movement in Spain with its slogan, Real Democracia, Real Democracy Now, drew the bright and inspiring line that all popular protest movements were then going to follow. Real democracy, a system where the people really have the power, is emphasized throughout these movements. However, there is not much reflection on the development of a real democracy applicable across nations.
All democratic activists must focus both on the practical struggle, but also on the theoretical construction of a concrete solution. Without a sound and global alternative, the movement will remain a kind of citizen lobby opposing injustice but will never become a revolution or a force able to bring out democracy. The distribution of power in a society is organized with a constitution. Currently, constitutions were written by politicians and elites who have granted privileges and have allowed the triumph of private interests over the general interests. It is important to write one or several democratic constitutions,
impossible to corrupt, that could be proposed as soon as possible as an alternative solution to all citizens. This requires forming interconnected working groups in charge of thinking through and writing constitutions to be submitted to popular assemblies, which will improve with criticism and debate with other productions. The process will ripen when one or several democratic constitutions eventually achieve consensus in the popular movements. The final step, the overthrow of existing institutions and the establishment of the new system, could then be considered. As you can see, the revolutions in which the intended social project had not been clearly defined by a constitution, a predefined organization of powers, were all recuperated: the Soviets and the USSR, the revolutions of the Arab Spring, the French Revolution, and so on.
Hi, I'm in the May the 15th movement in Spain, Spanish Revolution, and I would like to explain a couple of things about the movement. And I think they are actually very important, and perhaps they could be useful even outside Spain. First of all, I would like to compare the movement with this arrow. This is the first thing. And I would also like to compare this arrow and the movement with a computer program. As you all know, in computer programs, we usually use what we call plugins. Those are external applications that we use in the main program in order to improve the program. This is supposed to help the main program. The thing is that sometimes these external applications somehow jeopardize the main program. They sometimes are security problems to the main thing. Okay, so let's keep this in mind. In our debates here in Spain, sometimes we say that there are people that say that first of all the problem in Spain is the education. So the education, they say that the first thing that we have to change here in Spain is the education. But the thing is that the education is included in a system, not the system included in the education. And that means that if we change the system, later we can try to change the education also. But if we change the education, it will be more difficult to change afterwards the system. Okay, so there are people, as we say, that would like to change, first of all, the education. But here in Spain we also have people that say that the main problem we have is the way the votes are counted. And they are fighting to change the law for voting, for counting the votes. And they also would like to change something related with the parties, because here in Spain the lists are closed. We don't use open lists to the parties, political parties. So there are also people that would like to change that. But and that's true. All these things are true. We also need to change the education, that's for sure. But what we are doing here, we are losing strength and we are dividing our efforts. And this is very important, because the movement is this, and this will be our strength. This here make us weak, and this is a problem. What is happening right now in Spain is that in this movement we have modules, what we could call modules. We have a bunch of organizations that they're supposed to be fighting for the same things. But the thing is that they have to get to an agreement to talk about these things, to talk about what they really want. How is that possible if we have the same problems? This is not working well, because we are divided, and the system wants us to be divided. This is very important. We must be here all together, because that's what democracy is all about. Because we already know that we are different, but we must keep together. This is very important. Why we should do that? Well, the real problem here is that we have right now what we call a representative democracy in Spain, democracia representativa. So this means that this letter D means that we already have the power, because we are the people. This is something that our fathers and grandfathers achieved years ago here in Spain, 3 decades ago. So what this really means is that the power is already ours. We already have the power. But every 4 years we decide this, our representatives. But actually what happened now is that these guys here are the problem. These guys, the representatives, our politicians, are the problem in our system. Because what they do is divide the population, A and B, party A, party B, or whatever you want to call it. They divide to rule all these things, to rule the country, of course. But under a democracy label. Why is this the problem? Because, as you know, we have our system, and in this system we have representative democracy. What happened here is, right now, is that we are having attacks from outside. Economic attacks, big corporations and interests outside our countries. And the thing is that these guys here are the reason that this public infrastructure that is our shell, this is our protection, our public infrastructures that we already have, they jeopardize this. And this is a problem. This is the reason why these attacks work. This is very important. This is very important. So, the real thing here is that perhaps we should start a new change. We have to get rid of the politicians and start design, invent. We don't have to invent because it's already invented, but we have to use the democracy where people participate. So we have to change to a DP. democracy where people participate. That's for sure. This is very difficult, but we have the power, so we should decide whether we use these guys or not. The thing is that 30 years ago, it was very, very, very difficult to introduce this here. This is very difficult, but now, this was very difficult, but not right now. We have enough technology to do this. Now we can participate. We actually can. So the movement should be together, keep together. And the debate is that we have democracy. The power is already ours. We already know that. Okay, so we should decide whether we use this kind of democracy or this kind of democracy. This is the real debate. This is the real thing. And we shouldn't be divided, because these will be very, very, very bad for us. These guys are trying to achieve agreements about this, but the real thing is that we must keep together inside this arrow, and this arrow is pointed to a place. Where? Right here. Right here. We have to change the system, because now is the moment. So this is the debate. This is the real thing. And what we have to do is to, the movement, the May the 15 movement, what we have to do is to introduce this debate in the society. This is our work. This is what we really have to do. So we must decide if we want this kind of democracy, representative democracy that we already know and we already have, and we know that we have problems, and all the problems are caused by these guys here. Not everyone is bad, but they really cause every single problem here in our country. So this is the debate, and this is our job. What we have to do is decide and transmit to the population that there is another option. We can change our democracy. We can think about, participate in our reality, in our system. We can do that. And we have enough technology to do that right now. It was impossible 30 years ago, but right now we can do it. That's the reality. So we must do this. We have to transmit to the population. It doesn't matter if you belong to the right wing or left wing, whatever. We all have the same problems. We have these guys. And the thing is that if we change our democracy to a democracy where people participate with technology or whatever you want, the people will be more informed. Or we should work on that. And the thing is that if we are being attacked, we will increase our protection here, because these guys outside use the representatives to attack our countries, the corporations and whatever. But if they want to attack our system, this is our protection. This is the deal. They would have to use us, and that's, of course, very, very, very difficult. And the thing is that some people want to attack the banks. Okay, but they are private, and we have power here in the public system, because it's ours, because we already have a democracy. And that's what we have to work, and we have to realize that we already have the power. We already have the power. And what we have to do is to think whether we want to use the representative democracy or we would like to change it, and we would like to transform what we already know right now as politicians into just workers doing what people in democracy, where people participate, say. This is very important. Of course, and this is the last thing I would like to say, we already have experience in the representative democracy, but it would be something very new. This new democracy would be very new. So perhaps at the beginning it would be a little difficult, but well, I think we can do it. This is very important, and I would like to share this with the internet, and perhaps this information could be useful outside Spain. That's the reason why we're doing here this in English. So thank you very much, and good luck.
Hey, an alien!
Yes, I've travelled across space to check on the progress of your species.
Cool. Shall I take you to our leader?
Your what?
Our leader, the guy in charge.
The guy in charge of what?
Well, in charge of everything.
You have one guy in charge of everything?
No, he's in charge of government.
What is government?
Well, government makes the rules for us. It tells us what we can do and what we can't do.
So is government really smart? They come up with wise rules for you to follow?
Well, mostly. But some of its rules are really stupid.
Do you disregard those rules?
No, we have to follow the rules, even if they are stupid or we disagree with them. Government punishes anyone who disobeys the rules.
So you are slaves to government?
No, it's not like that at all. Government works for us, the people. It serves us. We're the boss.
It tells you what to do, and it punishes you with violence if you disobey it, and yet you're its boss?
Yeah.
But there are some things government does that you don't like.
Well, yeah, not everything government does is popular, like spending on wars, for example.
What is a war?
It's when government basically spends the people's money on weapons and soldiers and then sends them over to the other side of the world to kill a bunch of people over there and destroy their country. I don't like it that government does this.
Well, I can see why you might not like that. Have you humans reached the stage where you generally consider stealing, enslaving and killing each other to be bad things?
Oh yeah, we know that. Don't steal, don't attack, don't assault.
But you give money to government and they use it to kill people.
Well, yeah. But government does good things with tax money as well.
Why don't you stop paying for the things you don't like and only pay for the good things it does?
No, we can't do that. You can't just decide to stop paying taxes because the rules say that everyone has to pay taxes.
But the rules come from government though, don't they?
Yeah.
So government made a rule which says that everyone has to pay them money. So everyone pays taxes because if they didn't, government would punish them using violence?
Well, yes, but most people don't mind paying taxes. Most people feel obligated to pay taxes and obey government laws because it's for the good of society. Society needs government, and that means we all have to pay taxes.
So just to make sure I've got this straight, government makes the rules and you feel obligated to follow the rules, even the ones you don't like, and it tells you what to do and threatens to punish you if you don't do what it says, and it uses some of the money that it's taken from you using threats of violence to pay for things you don't like and actually think are immoral, like mass murder.
Yeah, but we can ask it to please tell us to do smart things, and please don't take our money and use it to kill people. We're allowed to ask them to tell us to do what we want them to tell us to do.
Are you guys just scared of this thing? Is government some huge monster that can just squish you at any moment if you disobey?
No, government isn't a monster.
Well, what is it then? Could you draw me a picture of it?
Government isn't really the sort of thing you can draw a picture of.
Maybe you could take me to it. Where is government?
You mean the building?
Government is a building.
No, but the politicians who make up the government have buildings they work from.
So government is a group of these politicians?
Yeah.
Okay, so what species are these politicians?
Well, they're human.
Like you?
Yeah.
So politicians are humans and they're government. You're a human, but you're not government.
No.
So it's the politicians, they're the ones that boss the rest of you around and make you do things you don't want to do and take your money using threats of violence. But even though you're all humans, you're not allowed to boss them around and take their money?
No, they'd put us in a cage if we did that. But look, it's not like the politicians can just do whatever they want. Like, a politician can't just come up to me on the street and make me give him money. They can't do that. Politicians can only do things like that in their job, when they're working for government.
Oh, so politicians aren't government, they just work for government?
Yeah.
Okay, so government isn't a monster, and it isn't a building, and it's not politicians, it's something else. And it employs politicians, who are just regular humans, who get to order everyone else around and take their money. How does a regular human become a politician?
Well, that's the great thing about our government. It's a democracy, and that means that the people actually have the power, because we get to decide who among us get to be the politicians. We get to vote. And if a politician starts doing things we don't like, we can just replace him with someone else at the next election.
So the people that get chosen to be politicians only get to boss people around and take their money for a short time, and then they go back to being regular humans?
Exactly.
That sounds like a powerful position to be in. But if you get to choose who does that, I assume that politicians are always the wisest, most honest, caring and respected people among you.
Well, no, not really. I wouldn't say politicians are known for being honest, or wise, or caring. And they're certainly not the most respected people among us. Come to think of it, most politicians are lying, power-hungry crooks.
The ones you chose?
Yeah, they're always doing things we don't like. They use taxpayers' money to enrich themselves and their friends, and they never keep their promises to voters. They've been caught stealing and lying and taking bribes, and they mostly do what the big corporations want. Yeah, they're always doing stuff like that. They're completely corrupt. They're a bunch of lying crooks.
But you said that most humans know that stealing and beating each other up and killing are wrong. And you said that you have the power because you can change who's in charge. So why don't you just replace the lying, thieving, murderous, crooked politicians with some regular people?
Well, we don't try to elect lying crooks. It just always turns out that way. But we have to have a government because some humans are nasty and might kill or enslave or steal. Civilization just couldn't survive without government.
Let me get this straight. Because you're worried about the small number of nasty people that are willing to kill, enslave and steal, you think it's necessary for your survival to have a system where some humans among you, for a short while, get to call themselves the government, and they get to order everyone else around like slaves and, if they want, commit mass murder overseas, using money they stole using threats of violence. Politicians get to kill, enslave and steal, because if they didn't, someone else might. And you try to elect good, honest people to be politicians, but what happens every time is that the people you elect turn out to be corrupt, evil, lying crooks. That's your system.
Yeah, that's pretty much government.
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever, and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, "Whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end." "My name is Mr. Smith," he said to the slaves, "and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward you will no longer be slaves, but free men." Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. "You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones," Mr. Smith continued. "You are free. No more would you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves." Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. "In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want," Mr. Smith said. "However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation." Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. "For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge," said Mr. Smith, "since he is the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new, free Jones plantation." He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. "And this shall be our motto," Mr. Smith announced. "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men." Finally convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
"We all want this plantation to do well," Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, "so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work. Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail, and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out to the fields to start your first day of work as free men."
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith had a grim expression on his face as the daily meeting began. "I have an unpleasant duty to do today," he said. Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished. 2 men tied Charles to the whipping post. I take no joy in this, Mr. Smith continued, but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer. The whip cracked against Charles' back. But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits. A young man named Samuel stepped forward. But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before? How can you say that? Mr. Smith asked. I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel? Well, no, he answered. But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work? I'm surprised at your ingratitude, Mr. Smith answered. None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, that you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints. With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It has been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing's changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all of the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all? Your time is up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, two supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience. The whip fell and Samuel let out a grunt. Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished. The whip fell again and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous. At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules, Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law? There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. We must maintain order, Mr. Smith proclaimed, to make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous. To have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve. Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.
What you have been taught about government and politics is no more accurate or reasonable than what Mr. Smith taught the slaves. If you're ready to look through the veil of rhetoric and propaganda to see the reality beneath, get a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition. It will change the way you see the world.
Guys, order another round because we're staying here.
Yeah.
What was I thinking going back to Ant Island? I mean, we just got here, and we have more than enough food to get us through the winter, right? Why go back?
But there was that ant that stood up to me.
Yeah, but we can forget about him. Yeah, it was just one ant. One ant.
Yeah, you're right. It's just one ant.
Yeah, boss. They're puny.
Puny? Say, let's pretend this grain is a puny little ant. Did that hurt?
Nope.
Well, how about this one?
Are you kidding?
How about this? You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line. That's why we're going back.